Welcome everybody to Hand of the Day 43. This is a pretty interesting one. So this is similar to one of the Hand of the Days that we did last week, where we are facing all in a bet line and 3-bet pot, except this time a few things are different. First of all, we're holding King 10, which is 2-pair on the flop. That does get devalued on a very scary board. And then second of all, we're also playing against a Maniac reg, who is a hyper aggro reg who 3-bets very wide from big blind versus small blind. They bluff a lot post-flop, even for 3 streets. So we can say that this line in general is going to be overbluffed, but the question is, should we call on this texture with a hand that is quite weak? This one I think was pretty interesting, because in order to solve it, we have to understand how aggressive does this player have to be in order for it to be profitable to bluff catch with such a weak hand on the board. There were a few responses to this one. One of them did point out that if this is a Maniac who has at least a basic understanding of ranges, they know that we arrive at the river with a lot of flush draws and straight draws, which, if I understand what Frank is saying correctly, means that they're a little bit less inclined to value bet here and maybe a little bit less inclined to bluff. I believe Frank voted to fold, if I'm not mistaken. That, I think, supports what he's saying. Another one comes from the Godson, who says to throw it away unless he's really crazy, because this player is going to have a lot more flushes that shouldn't exist, and a lot of random Jack-X in this range. So I think two main points that are being raised here are, number one, is this player going to be value jamming straights? Because if they are, then obviously it's going to make bluff catching significantly worse. And then number two, what exactly does their bluffing range look like? And I think when you understand where the bluffs come from on a bit of a deeper level, it can actually make these sorts of decisions in game a little bit simpler. Because if you haven't looked at a sim where you're looking at specifically what bluffs could this player be overbluffing, then it becomes a bit more difficult to visualize what sort of hands they could have in this spot, which looks like it blocks a large chunk of their range. So let's head over into the solver, and I will show you guys if this is a good or a bad bluff catching spot. I want to quickly start off with just the GTO solution here. So we are facing 30% on the flop, and King 10 is more than fine to just call. It's the 4 of diamonds and then goes 75% pot. Again, this hand just wants to call here. And if we get over to the river, you'll see that the value jamming range will not include many straights because it is a pretty wet board. Instead, it's mainly going to be flushes and a decent number of straight flushes, surprisingly. And against that range, King 10 just does not call. Solver does prefer to call with straights or flushes, basically anything that overlaps a little bit better with the tiny portion of straights that our opponent has in their range in the solver. Of course, the EV of King 10 in practice is going to be very different from what we're looking at in game, and blockers are going to matter a little bit less. Now, in theory, bluffs are very difficult to find here for most players. You'll see that because the board is so high, it blocks many of their natural bluffs like ace-queen or king-queen, which would not connect if it were a lower board. So instead, they have to bluff 100% of the time with their suited connectors, and they even have to bluff with a lot of their low pairs, third pairs, and I think Solver even bluffs with some of their king X here, which is significantly wider than I think most players would think to bluff here. In general, bluff catching on these sorts of higher boards is going to be far worse when our opponent takes the bet line. It just blocks most of their bluffs. This is a very consistent data pattern. That's also very easy to remember. But of course, we're playing up against a complete Maniac, who 3-bets very wide from these late positions. I think this was a valid strategy at one point because data did show that people were overfolding against 3-bets preflop. And so one thing that people would do is that they would raise 100% of the time with all of the mixed frequency raises that Solver likes to have. So if something like 10-5 or 10-4 only raised 30% of the time or 40% of the time, they would do it 100% of the time. And this would result in a very aggressive 3-betting strategy from blind versus blind. People would also overfold a lot post-flop, and it's still mostly the case, for sure. You just have to be a bit more careful, I like to think. So there was a very big incentive for people to do that. I didn't go all the way, so I only gave our opponent these hands 75% frequency if it was raising them less than 75% frequency pre-flop. And you can see the other hands like ace-5 and jack-10 and whatever that Solver is raising a bit more often than 75%. I haven't touched that. So overall, this range is very bluff heavy. When our opponent has this weak of a range on the flop, they do not prefer to range bet. So I manually locked them to range bet. And I didn't touch anything about the solution on the turn around the river because I think it would be good for us to very quickly model that together and show you how I would go about it. So our opponent goes 75% on the turn, and on the river, they decide to go all in. You'll see that King 10 is now roughly 0 EV as a call, but so are most other hands, right? So it just has neutral bluff catching properties. have to find some calls with ace 10, have to find some calls with king 10. It still doesn't tell us a lot of information. But the reason why I gave our opponent this wide of a range is to sort of illustrate what kind of bluffs they would have if they were to be too aggressive over 3 streets. Going back to the turn, we can actually go ahead and select the low pairs, the ace highs, and the nothing hands, and you'll see that a large number of their bluffs are indeed coming from these weaker ace highs. Offsuit combos are always going to be weighted much heavier than the suited counterparts because there's 3 times as many of these as there are of these. And there's also a lot of Jack-X, which I think makes incredible sense, but the Jack-X is going to be a straight on the river, so it's not going to be a hand that is able to really bluff again. And the same thing goes for the Ace-X. So that's why I chose this specific river card for the example. If we keep these tags enabled and we look at the river bluffing range, again, you'll see that even though our opponent has such a wide range coming into the flop, they have to bluff nearly 100% of the time with all of these hands. Quite clearly, it's probably not a good bluff catching spot, of course, unless our opponent is not going to be jamming very often with their straights. If they're a very aggressive player, maybe they will be. It's really difficult to say. But the fact that they don't have a lot of bluffs in this spot likely makes it bad for catching, at least when we just look at the solution without doing any additional node locking. But that's where the node locking part does actually come in, because I want to demonstrate how often they would have to bluff if they were also over bluffing on the turn. Because we established that this is a very aggressive regular who's probably aware that people don't defend wide enough, and that's what incentivizes them to overbluff for all 3 streets. So let's go ahead and do that together, and then there's going to be some really good takeaways in just a quick second. I'm going to go right over here to Set Strategy and Lock Node, and I am going to very quickly select all of the weak hands in their range, and I'm just going to decrease the checking frequency with them. That's going to naturally funnel them into the 75% bet size. Let's say they're over bluffing by a fairly large margin because they are so aggressive. You will see that this just means they're betting all of their low pairs, ace highs, and nothing hands a lot more often on the turn than they should. Next up, we're going to clear those combos. We go to press tree and then we just solve from here. It's on the turn, so it takes only a few seconds. And now we're able to look at what their bluffing range would look like on the river if they were over bluffing on the turn. So the solver adjusts its value range a little bit, and you'll still see that it's bluffing nearly 100% of the time. But because they're over bluffing on the turn with those hands, I think it just makes it a little bit more clear that those would be the hands that they would continue to have to bluff on the river. Now that we've done that, the next thing to do is just look at the river spot and see if the bluffing strategy changes. Here, it really doesn't all that much. The third pairs, the low pairs, and the nothing hands still have to bet nearly 100% of the time because so many of those turn bluffs, like the Jack-X and the Ace-X, did convert to hands that are not able to bluff anymore. The board does improve a large number of our opponent's bluffs. You could argue that they could be betting with 9-8, pocket 8s, pocket 7s, etc., but those hands are still not that abundant in their range compared to these ace highs and the Jack-X hands. The fact that they still have to bluff nearly 100% of the time on the river is probably going to make it a bit of a bad spot for bluff catching, I would say. The big caveat is, of course, are they always going to be jamming with their straights? Because some aggressive players will, but others will not. I think the psychology is very interesting. A lot of aggressive players will want to value bet thin because they'll want to balance out their bluffs, which is definitely a fine way to play, but others will recognize that if a spot is very good for bluffing, it's not going to be ideal for value betting. That can create a very big imbalance that is going to make bluff catching profitable regardless of what the texture is. Because if they're not value betting enough and they're over bluffing, things get skewed out of proportion so much so quickly. With that in mind, let's see how people voted. I did estimate that the split was going to be 80-20 in favor of folding, and I got super lucky because that is exactly what people voted. We had 14 votes and most people chose to fold. I think with the information that was available here, folding is definitely going to be the right play. However, if the board were a little bit different, if it were something like the 8 of spades, or maybe it paired one of those cards, all of a sudden bluffing will become much better because the Ace-X and the Jack-X in our opponent's range is not going to be blocked. And then, like the Godson said, if he's really crazy, bluff catching on almost any texture is going to be very good. And one other final thing I should mention really briefly is that people said if this opponent is over bluffing, they're going to have a lot more flushes in their range than they should. And while this is definitely true at face value, I think a much more important thing to keep in mind is that if the board were a little bit different, like the 3 of spades, a large number of our opponent's overbluffs are not going to come from spade combos on the turn. So they'll definitely have a lot of Jack 5 and Jack 4 because they're 3-betting it too much and then they're following through with it on the turn at a higher frequency. But if they're really aggressive, then they're going to have 3 times as much of the other Jack 5 and Jack 4 combos as they will with the flush draw. Things will still get skewed towards not flushes. Furthermore, many of their bluffs will come from the offsuit combos, especially if they're just going with this blanket approach of 3-betting all of those hands at 75% frequency preflop. That is just going to, again, skew our opponent's range away from flushes. So definitely keep in mind that if an opponent is just too aggressive overall in the game, they will not have as many flushes as a tighter player would in the spot. I think it makes a lot of intuitive sense, but it's something that is important to always keep in mind. I hope you guys enjoyed the video analysis, and I will see you in the next one.